Today I'm discussing Kurt Levine's field theory and how different perspectives would view his field theory. So I'm going to talk about, we're going to look at the Gestalt perspective, the psychoanalytical perspective, and the behaviorist perspective, and how they all kind of tie together and have play a role in how each perspective works and how they each have similarities. So what is field theory? So field theory was created by Kurt Levine. The main principle behind Levine's field theory was that individual behavior is determined by two forces. One is a personal force and one is a situational force. Multiple factors play a role in influencing our behavior. And so some that come from personal or inside reaction within us, while another is from our environment or situational. So an example of the personal forces would be something like dreams or thoughts, while the situational forces would be like a kid who acts differently in front of his or her parents compared to when they're around a group of friends. Levine explained field theory with a very simple equation as B equals the function of the personal and environmental variables. And so that brings us to the Gestalt perspective. Now, Gestalt perspective was the main principle was the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And then with that came Franz Brentano talking about act psychology. Now, act psychology was a belief that mental processes are active rather than passive, meaning there had to be an active process that interpreted and organized the sensory information, thus came to the conclusion that thinking is active. And so after that came Carl Stumpf and his cognitive theory of emotion. Physiological, meaning that physiological arousal from a stimulus leads to a cognitive interpretation of that arousal. And so these two were heavily under the thought that that our thinking and our thoughts and our cognitive activity played a major role in the influence of our behavior and how we acted. And that brings us to the psychoanalytical perspective. Now, psychoanalysts believe that a large portion of our behavior was based on suppressed memories from our childhood or past events that were in our subconscious. One of those being Freud, who also used a concept called, or a practice called, free association. This encouraged patients to talk through their issues by saying whatever comes to their minds without censoring their thoughts. So again, under the belief of those personal variables that that influence our behavior, by talking through and talking through our thoughts without stopping or censoring them, that is why we behave the way we do. And this played into thinking as an active process by Brentano and the School of Act Psychology. Then came Peer Janet, who actually came before Freud, and they had very similar concepts and ideas. And so there's speculation that Freud may have stole some of Janet's ideas. But anyway, Janet followed the same school of thought as Descartes and his interactive dualism between the spiritual mind and the physical body. So this meant that cognitive activity was taking place both at the voluntary and the automatic level, with the voluntary level having us fully aware of our surroundings, the automatic level including behaviors like dreaming and our perceptions. And then Freud believed in more of the personal variables that take place on the inside of each individual to influence behavior, while Janet first expanded on that with his automatism concept. And so that brings us to the behaviorist perspective. And so, behaviorist perspective was founded, and it's got its principles under positivism, which is this concept that scientists can only know what they actually observe through their senses or through scientific instruments. And so, with that came, and kind of the pioneer of that was John Watson. And one of his first experiments is known as the Kerplunk experiment, was completed with rats making their way through a maze. And what Watson found was that the rats were controlled by their environment and that they would smack into walls in making their way through the maze. And so it was like a trial and error type of thing is what they were doing. And so he concluded that the rat's behavior was reflexive and reactive to the environment. And so Watson claimed that that we could transfer these results to humans, and that behaviorists don't see any difference in man and animal when it comes to behavior. And so after that came Skinner. And so B.F. Skinner believed that, like Levine's field theory, that there is more to our behaviors than just what is observable through our senses, but also through our inward experiences, or what Levine classified as those personal variables. And so Levine really followed the behaviorist foundations of positivism, and that real data comes from observing behavior and observing that behavior in the real world. And so he, along with Watson and Skinner, were huge believers in seeing behavior and how it played out in the real world. And so, to tie it all together, psychoanalytical perspective, they believed in the inner workings, the unconscious, the unobservable influences of our behavior, and thought that was the main influence on individuals' behavior. While behaviorists strictly focused on what could be observed either through our senses or measured with scientific tools, thus leading to the belief that our environment was the main influence of our behavior. Then Gestalt perspective kind of tied it all together, and they believed that the whole was more than the sum of its parts. And so Levine and his field theory incorporate that philosophy in noting that our behavior is more than just what is going on around us with our environment, but it is also those inner workings or those personal variables that influence us well and influence us as well, and both need to be accounted for when observing and discussing behavior.